Hello friends and welcome to another video. This is going to be my 2024 reading wrap up where I just kind of go through everything that I read this year. And as I always do for some reason that I can't remember, I always do it as a PowerPoint, and I'm also on my laptop home for Christmas, so I don't have a camera that works. So again, just I guess picture my face if you want to, or don't. That's up to you. I think most people here will be the most interested in the fantasy and sci-fi that I read, so that's what I'm starting out with and talking about in a little bit more detail. I have mentioned the project that I'm doing, looking specifically at books that explore trauma in some way in speculative fiction, so that's what I'm starting off my wrap-up with. The first book in this section that I read this year is Medusa's Sisters by Lauren J.A. Bear. And for this wrap up, I'm also keeping track of the number of books that I just kind of like frantically, desperately read in one sitting because I was really stressed out. So this was my first stress marathon read, and it was because of a breakup that happened at the very start of the year. We don't have to dwell on that, but for this book, I didn't love it. Prose, I do think that it had some really complex, like quote unquote unlikable female characters and like complicated relationships between sisters and between women. And I also thought the very ending was quite strong and emotional, but I found the writing to be very awkward. I found Medusa herself to not be very interesting in this retelling. And I think, there's been a lot of talk about these quote unquote like feminist mythology retellings that aren't really that transgressive, don't really have that much to say that's super interesting about feminism or the patriarchy, and I kind of think this one falls into that category. Next is Gold by Raven Kennedy. This is a popular like romantasy series that I've kind of been following along with for a while and like morbid fascination, I guess. I don't necessarily think they're good, but they are very entertaining. And in this book, at least, the main character was not attached at the hip to just who I find to be a very, very annoying, like insufferable alpha fae love interest. So that was nice. And yeah, I think I'm always looking for like a kind of junk food read that hits the spot of being entertaining, and these books continue to do that. But they're not well written. Like they don't particularly do any of their characterization or their themes very well. And they also were getting way more generic over time. Like they were very strange in the beginning, but they're becoming more and more like very generic, like following all of those romantasy tropes beat by beat as they continue. I read The Deep End of the Sea by Heather Lyons. This is another Medusa retelling, and I liked that it was a very, very sweet, like incredibly sweet, very earnest hurt/comfort romance, if you're familiar with that fanfic trope. But it wasn't all that interested in being a Medusa retelling, and a lot of its like use of the mythology was very strange and kind of underdeveloped. And there were these really weird relationships between the secondary male and female characters that I felt were like just very like patronizing and condescending, with the men like talking down to the women, and it just being kind of like uh sexist in like a very passive way. So I didn't love that. The next book I read, I think this was the first book that I started for r/fantasy's bingo challenge. So this was what I read for my romantasy bingo square, and it is Blood Mercy by Bella Roth. I thought both of the characters in this were very likable. I thought that the most sort of emotionally compelling part was the female main character's relationship with her sister and kind of the story that unfolds with that. And I think a lot of people probably came to this curious about like the vampire smut. And I'm not going to say too much about that, but I thought it was well done. But this was super long. It was like almost 800 pages, and it was very slow. And I was disappointed that most of the development of the relationship felt like the vampire guy Leo just kind of telling her all about the culture and kind of info dumping. And I also don't really know where the relationship is going to go from here, because they're already magical soulmates by the end of this book, and there's like many, many more books in this series that are all very long. So I think it could have taken its time and really stretched things out, and I probably would have been more interested in continuing, but I'm not sure that I'm going to. For the Criminals Bingo Square, I read The Enchanted by Renee Denfeld, which is very beautiful, very deals with a lot of very difficult content, with a lot of grace and insight and just like compassion. And the writing itself is full of so much imagery and just like joy for life in a way, I guess, that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you're, hearing the description of a book about men on death row. I recently, I think last year, read Notes on an Execution, and I would say that for people who liked that and kind of its approach to how we think about serial killers and men who commit extreme violence, if you like the way that Notes on an Execution thinks about those things, I would say this is a good follow up with that, and it makes use of the magical realism elements really well. My next book for the Written in the 90s Bingo Square was Winter Rose by Patricia McKillop, who was one of my favorite fantasy writers. And the next thing that I started keeping track of is the books that I read that were set in evil forests. For some reason, like, magical evil forests. For some reason I read a lot of books in that category this year, so I wanted to keep track of them here as well. McKillop's books are famous for incredibly beautiful writing and their imagery and just having this super strange, ethereal, like lush, magical atmosphere to them. And so that was all very present here and as lovely as ever. And I also was really touched by the main relationship. It has a little bit more to it, I think, than some of her other romances that she's written. And I also really liked how it explored breaking generational trauma patterns. Um, I'm just sad because I have less books by her to read now. I'm really running out of them. And the plot itself was a little bit repetitive, but it's okay. Okay, my next read was another Evil Forest read, and that is The Butcher of the Forest by Premia Mohammed, which is a novella that came out this year. And I liked the writing in this a lot. It was very evocative and eerie, and kind of this ominous stream of consciousness to it almost that really created a strong sense of the setting and how kind of malicious it was. But I also thought that not all of the character work totally worked for me. I think it was just a little bit too short, maybe not quite enough time spent on it for some of the decisions and some of the things that unfolded to feel totally satisfying. My next book for the multiple point of views bingo square was How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. This was my next stress marathon read related to the job that I had at the time, which was pretty rough this year. This is a really great dystopian sci-fi book that combines these notions of how capitalism and technology and a world in pandemic kind of transform humanity and how humanity adapts. And it does all of that in a way that feels very real, but also in a way that feels very compassionate and hopeful. And I think it's really about how people find meaning and adapt to really difficult circumstances and find ways to still connect with each other and survive. And it really worked for me in how it explored all of that. Of course, there were a lot of points of views. There were some stories that were pretty repetitive and some of the points of views that were not totally as impactful, but I still really, really liked this. The next book I read was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana, which I read for the book club slash read along bingo square. And I just think that I'm learning that I'm not someone who loves like quote unquote cozy fantasy or like fantasy that's specifically branded as cozy fantasy. This was super cute and heartwarming and sweet. It really delivers on the whole idea of a found family and this core idea of like taking a risk on being vulnerable with people on multiple levels, kind of the whole mortifying ordeal of being known thing. I really liked how it did that, but I just sadly didn't love the romance, and I think I'm just a little bit averse to this very, very sweet, cozy fantasy style book. But I think for people who are more into that style of book, this would be really perfect. My choice for the indie slash self pub bingo square was The Demon of the Wood by Willow Quinn. And this was really cute for the most part. It was also kind of like mutual hurt comfort romance. It sort of had fairy tale meets D&D vibes, and it's just like these sweet characters kind of like getting to know each other while they're sharing a cottage. So that's like the first 75%, but then it just takes this drastic turn in the last quarter, and they become like mates, like Sarah J. Maas mates, and it gets very like horny in a way that doesn't make sense, and like the whole like violently possessive, like I'll destroy the world for you type stuff. And I just didn't see that coming. I don't think it fit with the rest of it. I don't like that in books. So, yeah, as I said in my last bullet point, I will never forgive Sarah J. Maas for what she has done to me personally and the way that she has infected this genre of like romantasy, fantasy romance stuff. But this was really cute for the most part. So this year I decided that I was going to read Ava Reed's new release, Lady Macbeth. And this was really a miss for me, and it made me decide that I needed to, well, I didn't need to, I wanted to write a more extensive essay about their books and why they just continually frustrate me and don't work for me. This one, I think, is probably the worst one in my opinion and the most frustrating. It doesn't do anything interesting as a retelling. The whole premise is that it's quote unquote giving Lady Macbeth a voice, but it turns her from this really infamous villainess who's super powerful into a beautiful, kind of waifish, disempowered teenager. The whole feminist aspect is just these very on the nose, like empowerment speeches from the love interest. All the other men in the book are like horrible and violent, and there are no other women in the castle for like 99% of the book for some reason. Any kind of like character growth or development is basically comprised of this sudden like empowerment epiphany that she has. Like I call it a girl boss epiphany here at the 94% mark in my ebook. Like it's just kind of all of this incoherent fluctuation in her decisions and when she uses her magic and when she doesn't do things throughout the entire book. And then we get this sudden like massive spurt of growth at the 94% mark. And I don't know, there's a lot more to it. A lot of people have said a lot of very valid criticisms of this book, including from the perspective of people who know a lot more about Shakespeare than I do, and people who know a lot more about Scottish history and language and culture. I understand that there is a lot to be critiqued on those levels as well, but for me, I just really don't think that Reed did anything interesting or successful, like talking about trauma or feminism or, giving a voiceless character a voice or anything like that. So yeah, this one really, really frustrated me. I decided that I wanted to read all of her published works for this essay that I made. So then I did The Wolf and the Woodsman, which I also included for my entitled Animals Bingo Square. I didn't hate this one as much. There are these little folk tales throughout that I liked. I do think that the main character has the most developed arc of any of Reed's characters, but I really bounced off the romance. I don't think that I jive at all with the way that Reed writes romances, and I found like the plot and the actual things that are happening in the story, like the things that we're spending time on, incredibly repetitive in the first half, and then just very messy and kind of lots of things that don't make any sense in the second half. So it wasn't necessarily bad in the way that the other of her books frustrate me, like with regard to the exploration of trauma and feminism, but I still don't think it was very good. Next was Goldfinch by Raven Kennedy, which is actually the last book in the Plated Prisoner series. I do think that this clearly had the most editing and the most care put into it as far as the writing goes. And it was still a very entertaining read. The problem with this one, and the problem with this series, not the only problem, but one of my big problems is that she writes these sex scenes that have these elements of dubious consent with her female characters who are like almost all rape survivors, and their in-game partners are supposed to be like their partners in healing and like these great supportive men. And that happens again in this book with a secondary character. And I just think that, I don't know, that sucks to me. But I'm also sad that there aren't any more books in this series because sometimes I just want like a really weird, entertaining, bad book. And I find these like they're not generically boring like bad fantasy. They're very unique and strange strange in how bad they are, so I'm kind of sad that I won't have any of them anymore. So back to books that I liked though. In the Halloween fall season, I read The September House by Carissa Orlando, and this was great. I loved how it compared the protagonist's relationship to her haunted house, to intimate partner violence. It also is just a great horror story that's very funny and entertaining. And I read this one for the Survival Bingo Square. The other horror book that I read was Wakenhurst by Michelle Paver, which I used for my set in a small town bingo square. And speaking of the setting, it was very creepy and atmospheric. We have like this Victorian manor set on the Fens in this very tiny, remote little village. All of this fervor over like medieval Christianity and demons and possessions and stuff. It's very spooky. I liked the main character in this a lot, and I liked how it talked about reproductive choice and reproductive abuse and how they relate to patriarchy. But I think that the story could have spent less time on the main character's journal entries because they get very repetitive as he's kind of losing his mind and trying to justify things to himself a lot. I was kind of disappointed that there weren't that many speculative elements. There were some, but they were pretty minor. And then it does have a very, very sad ending, which is not necessarily a bad thing by any means, but I just figured I'd mention it here for anybody. It's quite a downer in a way that I didn't necessarily expect. And then my last read for this section was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfeld for my Under the Surface bingo square. Oh, and I forgot to say, I think there was another stress marathon read somewhere. I think it was How High We Go in the Dark. But this was another stress marathon read on election night. This was, I thought, very well written. I thought it had some really interesting things to say about grief and loss, and I really liked the speculative elements of them being trapped under the sea. I thought it was very creepy and interesting, and that part was really well written. But I found the present day sections of the book, not the flashbacks, to be really repetitive. And I also felt like the sort of supernatural parts, the sort of mystery thriller parts, and the kind of more literary exploration of grief, I felt like they just didn't mesh together super well for me. There's just something like between how repetitive the present day parts were and like those combination of elements just didn't totally work for me. Okay, and I'll keep talking about speculative fiction now. This is stuff that I read that's still fantasy and sci-fi, but not specifically for that trauma reading project. First, probably one of my hot takes for the year. I did not really like Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. I thought it was perfectly pleasant. It was perfectly easy to read. Like, there wasn't anything wrong with it in that way. But I just felt that the characters and the romance were very, very flat. And I found, like, the world building and the plot of the fantasy journalists at war, I felt like it was very underdeveloped. So, yeah, this is one where I just completely missed the hype, which makes me sad because it sounded like something that I would love, but it really just wasn't. I also read Dark Woods, Deep Water by Helena Donato, which was my next Evil Forest book. And this was really cool. It's based on Eastern European mythology and, again, super atmospheric, very evocative setting and writing, very eerie and creepy. And I also thought that the author chose three very interesting characters to narrate the story. They're very different from each other, and they're not the kind of characters that I feel like I typically see as protagonists in fantasy stories. So this was very interesting. It was kind of doing its own thing, and I liked it a lot. The only thing that I didn't love is that I think some parts of the sort of uh, plan or plot that's happening don't totally make sense to me, but I think that is a pretty small element. Otherwise, I really, really liked this and thought it was super cool. Fortunately, a book that did meet the hype for me was Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. I read Vespertine by her, I think, last year and really liked it. The way that I think about her books is that they're just very, very polished young adult fantasy in the sense that everything feels incredibly well thought out. Everything just feels very well rounded. I loved the main trio of characters in this, and I loved the whole element of like the library setting and the sentient grimoires and all of that. I thought there was a lot to enjoy here. Again, The thing with this one, I think more so probably than the previous book, is that if you really sit and think about like why are certain things happening this particular way, why are certain things happening at this point in time, there are some things that I guess leave you with unanswered questions. But I think this is one that you just want to have fun with, enjoy the atmosphere, enjoy the characters, because all of that is really, really solid and fun. And then I read Knight's Master by Tanith Lee, which is a short story collection, kind of like interlocking short story collection. Her writing is just amazing. Kind of like with Patricia McKillip, I think she's one of the people who just has the best prose and fantasy that I've read. It's very, very like lush and decadent, and it's almost like suffocating in that sense. I feel like that's the best way to describe it, is it almost feels like you're just like buried under the weight of how opulent everything is. And these are some really inventive short stories. The way that they're linked is really cool. The overall mythology and world is really cool. They kind of have this the feeling of mythology or fairy tales, but are her own unique stories. Uh, the thing I think that a lot of people know Tanith Lee's adult work for is for being very, very dark. There's lots of cruelty and violence. And so I will say that happens very repetitively here, and it can get a bit wearing over time. And she also writes a lot about sexuality and some very unique elements of sexuality, which I think usually I'm okay with. But there was like this stuff with spiders having sex in this book that was a bit much for me. But other than that, this was really cool. Another Evil Forest read was a 2024 release, young adult fantasy, Where the Dark Stands Still by A.B. Poranek. This, I think, would just be like a nice, quick, fun fantasy read. Like it has a romance, it has some nice folktale, kind of fairy tale, foresty vibes. I think it's a nice, pleasant read in that regard. But it spends so much time on the romance, particularly on the love interest, who falls into that category. I called it here the a misunderstood ancient man who does terrible things for a good reason and falls in love with a teenage girl, but it's not weird to the detriment of everything else in the book. Honestly, I was thinking about it, and the amount of time that she spends like unraveling his lies, this book would be very, very short if he wasn't like lying to her about everything. And I understand this was very inspired by Howl's Moving Castle, but it doesn't capture any of what I really enjoy in Howl's Moving Castle. And I feel like you hear people recommend books with the phrase Howl's Moving Castle vibes a lot online, and I just feel like I don't trust that phrase. Like, what do you mean by Howl's Moving Castle vibes? Be more specific. To bingo reads for my first in a series square, I read A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. I probably could have chosen a lot of different things I read this year for that square, but this just happened to be the one that I picked up at the time. I will say I appreciate the intentions behind this and the sentiment behind it, and I did really like the robot character. But this was kind of just annoying to me. I found the main character to be very annoying. I found just the kind of overall writing style and the way that things are conveyed to be kind of twee and a little bit kind of flat for me. Um, and I also found it sort of heavy-handed in its messages. Like they're not necessarily things that I disagree with, but I don't necessarily know that I liked the way that they were conveyed, like very straightforwardly and in this kind of I don't know. I don't know why the word like condescending comes up for me because it's certainly like this is very earnest, it's very good-hearted, but something about the way that it's conveyed and something about like yeah, just like about this sort of cozy fantasy, cozy sci-fi in general, it just doesn't work for me. And I don't know if that's a me problem or not because I do know that a lot of people love these books. And then for my reference materials bingo square, I finally finished off the Lord of the Rings trilogy with Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. I felt very silly like trying to think of something to say about this. I don't feel like I have anything to say about it that is new in any way, but I am so glad that I finally finished the trilogy. I truly enjoyed it. And I hope that I will be able to return to some of Tolkien's other stuff now that I've read The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series, but I'm not sure which one I should turn to next. For the Eldritch Creatures bingo square, I read Hyperion by Dan Simmons. So I don't really know how to talk about this one because I would say like 99% of it is absolutely amazing. Some of the best sci-fi I've ever read. I I've been calling it like amazing in a brain chemistry altering way because I feel like it really does get to that level of just like being so engrossing and making you think so much about what it's saying. Especially, I think most people consider of the stories that are being shared, the priest's tale and the scholar's tale to be the best. And yeah, I think about those all the time. I just like my quibbles are there's this one story that really sexualizes teenage girls, and it just feels very, very gross in how it does it. And then I read a couple of posts and articles about how that pattern of sexualizing teenage girls continues in some of the other books by this author, which is just really disappointing. And I also feel like the sex scenes are pretty embarrassing and very like men writing women, if you are familiar with that subreddit. So yeah, I don't know how to talk about it because so much of this is absolutely amazing, and I'm so glad that I read most of it. But I can't get over the way that this one story talks about the teenage characters, and I mean that's really the big one that's just hard for me to swallow. For my published in 2024 Bingo Square, I read The Practice, The Horizon, and the Chain by Sophia Samatar, which was another stress marathon read. I believe that I just sat up and read the whole thing the night that I quit the sexual assault advocacy job that I'd been doing for a very long time. And it was kind of just what I needed at that point in time. I just think she's an amazing writer, and she's just as good at sci fi as she is at fantasy, I think. And it's this very, I think, incisive look at like performative politics, specifically in academia, looking at what oppression and resistance look like in the context of those academic circles, and also just this very, very courageous, kind way of thinking about creating change and what like real resistance looks like. And I just feel like I read it at the perfect time, and I'm very grateful for it. I'm editing to add, I forgot to say that the prose in this is really, really beautiful, as Sophia Samatar's prose always is, so that's another huge plus. For the Dreams Bingo Square, I read The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin, who is another one of my favorite fantasy sci-fi writers. I thought this was great. It is really interesting in how it uses this sci-fi story to explore like how we go about trying to change the world, and utilitarianism and paternalism, and doing so, changing things for people and thinking that you know what's best, and acting upon people rather than acting with people. And then I have to say, because I'm in the process of becoming a therapist, and this book is about a psychiatrist who ends up doing all kinds of horrible things with his power, I think you can also see it as a warning of the harm that an unethical therapist or mental health practitioner can cause when they assume that they're the expert and they deny their client agency, and, trying of having to have that utilitarian perspective and that paternalistic perspective when dealing with the human mind. So that's probably not a takeaway that everybody might have, but I've been thinking a lot about that as I become a therapist, so I feel like she really hit that message home as well. The only thing about this that I didn't love, there are very long, especially just in the beginning, very long detailed descriptions of the different sleep states and how biofeedback works, which I guess are things that I kind of had already been familiar with, and so I just felt like I didn't need the descriptions of those to be quite as long. But otherwise, I'm so glad that I read another Ursula Le Guin, and this was great. For the five short stories bingo square, I read a short story collection called In the Forest of Forgetting by Theodora Goss. And I thought several of these were very beautiful, very moving. It explores a lot of like life in communist Eastern Europe and themes of art, like control of art and art as liberation, and a couple of like reoccurring characters and things like that. So I thought that was all really cool. I think a few too many stories just left me kind of disappointed at the end, and I just realized I like my like very ethereal fantasy in secondary worlds as opposed to our real world, and this was a little bit, I feel like there was just a little bit too much mundane mixed in with the magical just for my personal taste, but that is really just a personal thing, of course. I read The Palace of Stone by Shannon Hale, which is the second book in the Princess Academy series, which I loved as a kid and I'm going back to finish. And a project that I'm kind of calling like reading for little Charlotte. I still love the main character in this and a lot. I love all of her friends and relationships, and I like that these books are using fantasy for middle graders as a way to explore why education is important and things like class injustice and stuff like that in a very, I think, like kid friendly way. But this was definitely not as good as the first book. There's not as much focus on the relationships with all the other girls of the mountain, which I really liked. And as far as like the actual rebellion or revolution that happens in this book and how it kind of resolves, it's very messy, and I don't think a lot of it makes a lot of sense and it kind of strange credulity. And then for the alliteration bingo square, I read The Heretic's Guide to Homecoming by Sienna Tristan. I thought that I was going to love this. It sounded perfect for me. I sadly didn't like it as much as I thought I would. It is a very realistic depiction of a character with anxiety and self-hatred, and it does introduce a lot of interesting cultures and history and stories as they journey, but I really bounced off the writing style for a lot of reasons. And I did not find that the specifically like the recovery or healing part of the mental health depiction was super convincing to me. And I felt like there was kind of going back to the writing style. One of the big problems for me throughout was that there was a lot of telling versus showing. So yeah, I'm really bummed that I didn't like this one more because I've been saving it and sure that I would really enjoy it. For the Judge a Book by its cover square, I chose The Herb Witch's Apprentice by Irene Chow, which obviously, if you can see the cover, you can see why I chose the book for that square because I was like, oh, this looks like the most adorable, like magical, enchanting thing ever. And it was really cute. It was super sweet and funny, and it was very reminiscent of like Ella Enchanted and all of those sort of like middle grade fairy tale books that I really loved as a kid. I thought that the protagonist was a little frustrating, and I think there are just some elements that could have been a little bit more polished. And I also would have loved more like specific details and descriptions of things, especially like the imagery and the food and all of the sort of little magical details and like life at the palace and stuff. But this was super cute and fun. And I think I got the second book in a Kindle deal, so I'm looking forward to reading the next one too. This is kind of moving away from the more typical stuff that I read. I did have a recurrence of Dragon Age hyperfixation when Dragon Age Veilguard came out this year. So I just went back and reread Heart in Hightown, which I don't even know. It's there's a character in the games who is like a famous author in the games, and this is a published version of one of his books. I feel like that's hopefully that makes sense the way that I said it. Um, and yeah, it hit me hard with the Dragon Age 2 nostalgia, which I think is a hot take, but I will defend that game. I love Dragon Age 2. I read my book when we walked in memory. I kind of always do this after something's been released. I give it a little bit of time, and then after it's been released and the dust has kind of settled, I'll like reread it and do what I think of as like an autopsy. Try to think like, okay, what do I want to do differently next time? What do I like? And kind of analyze things that way. So yeah, I did that this year. And I think I still mostly like it. I haven't decided that it's super embarrassing and bad yet, so we'll see. Now for like the really random embarrassing stuff. I'm still listening to a lot of audiobooks when I drive, so this is kind of the next section. I kind of got interested into this phenomenon of books that at some point blew up on social media, usually because someone had a really strong online presence. They got published because of that social media hype, and then there was some kind of backlash, and they're now considered to be very bad by general consensus. So this happened before TikTok, actually, with a YouTuber's book series. These books in the Andromeda Saga by Sasha Alsberg and Lindsay Cummings. Yeah, this was pretty bad. It's very reminiscent of Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas in space, and then there's just like a whole bunch of extra points of views that don't really add anything. Yeah, so this wasn't great. The next book that kind of follows, or series that follows this trend, is Powerless by Lauren Roberts. I also read these as audiobooks when I was driving. These are, I think, the best way to describe them is they really kind of condense every possible fantasy romance trope. The first one is basically the Hunger Games combined with the Red Queen, and just like without any sort of political commentary or anything like that. And then I really don't know what happened in the second book. I would say like almost nothing happens in the second book. The third series following in this pattern is the Lightlark series by Alex Astor, which I started out as a buddy read with a friend, but then we just realized like, oh, this isn't actually funny to read together, so we didn't make it all the way through. But it was entertaining enough to read on my own. It's just that I've never read a book that has like so much incomprehensible, convoluted magic, plot elements that make no sense. And like all of that is combined with the author like just fixating and clearly caring about the quote unquote shadow daddy romance more than anything. There is so much more. There's so much more to say about each of those books, the Androma books, the Powerless books, and Lightlark. There's a lot of YouTubers that have kind of dissected all of these a lot more than me. Um, and I don't necessarily feel like my skill as a YouTuber is going to be to do like those really deep dives into popular TikTok-esque books unless they're Sarah J. Maas or I have something angry to say about like the feminism or the trauma parts of them. At least that's where I am right now. So yeah, I did read all of those. I know that they've kind of been dunked on quite a lot on BookTube, but I don't know that I really have anything particularly new to say about them. The next book of this kind is The Night and Its Moon by Piper CJ. Same thing, blew up on social media, got published, had this backlash. This, I don't really have anything to say about. Like, it was definitely not good to me, but it was very wording and very slow and not very interesting to me, so I don't find a lot of things like the other ones that I've mentioned I enjoyed reading because they were just very funny in some way, but this one I didn't find entertaining in the same way. Also, jumping on TikTok romantasy trends, I listened to the audiobook of Fourth Wing. So, my take about this, I don't necessarily think it's like a quote unquote good book, but it is very solidly constructed and competent, I think, compared to all of the other books that I just mentioned. And if I read it and it didn't really like hit the mark for me, I totally understand why others would find it so entertaining. So, I don't know, that's kind of my take on Fourth Wing is like, no, it's not really for me. I don't necessarily think like it's a subversive work of art or anything, but that's not what it's trying to be, and I think it's good at what it's doing in a way that a lot of books that get popular like it aren't. This is actually, this section is a little embarrassing because I feel like I read a lot of a lot of strange stuff. Another audiobook, The Princess Will Save You by Sarah Henning. This is pitched as a Princess Bride retelling, which is why I picked it up, but I don't think that's necessarily true. And I don't, this would have been like completely forgettable to me, but I ended up picking up the library copy of the ebook because I was like trying to figure out what was going on with the writing, and it feels very, very flat and stilted and strange. And like I don't know quite how to articulate it, but I've never really read anything written quite that way before, and it was very distracting. So, probably the most embarrassing thing I read this year was The Dark Elf Secret Baby by Celeste King. So, I found this on Amazon while I was looking for something completely different. Like, I'm not going to talk too much about what I was looking for, but I saw it and I was like, oh my god, look at that cover, look at that summary. Like, I need to know what's happening here. So, the book itself, I actually don't think was very entertaining. Like, it wasn't funny bad, it was very generic and forgettable. But I looked at this author and she has 192 books listed on Goodreads, and I think at least 39 or 40 that were published in 2023 by my count. So I'm just fascinated. Like, most of them are quite short, they're closer to like novellas in length they're very simple. They're not like complex or well written in any way, but I feel like AI has to be involved in some way. Like I don't know if that's the case. That's just a possibility, but I don't know how that's physically possible. Like I just it's such a mystery to me. So if anybody has any guesses or information about what's going on with Celeste King, please tell me because I really want to know. Okay, and then last but not least, of course, I read My Immortal twice by myself. I mostly just include My Immortal in my reading wrap-ups and like on Goodreads and stuff because I think it's funny and I'm committed to the bit at this point. But I did read it twice this year. Once when I was going insane on the drive to my new town when I was moving. And then I decided after that that I thought it would be really funny to make a YouTube video about it, which I still have in the works and hopefully will be out sometime early next year. Um, but I did read My Immortal twice by myself this year, so that I count as a win in life for me. I already feel like I've been talking forever, but these next sections are going to go a lot faster. I read more like kind of general fiction, historical fiction, lit fic, stuff like that this year. I feel like for the past few years I've been reading a lot more sci-fi and fantasy just solidly, so it was fun to kind of dip my toes back into some other genres. First is A Man Called Uwe by Frederick Bachman. I was hoping that this would make me super sad and just make me sob my eyes out. It was very heartwarming and funny, but it didn't quite have that impact. Next is Gather the Daughters by Jenny Melamed. This was another stress marathon read for the sexual assault job. I thought this was a really amazing exploration of like Christian fundamentalists, patriarchy, and child abuse, and how society and societal norms shape our sense of morality. I think this book has kind of proved contentious for a lot of readers, and I understand why, but it really worked for me. Next was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. I was kind of like, maybe I should try to read something like super cozy and comforting, and that was the first thing that got recommended. And I just wish that I hadn't read it. I feel like it was just a complete, like, this is the word that I used, is just a complete nothing burger. Like, it didn't do anything interesting, and I was so mad at how little it used its octopus character. I don't know, it was just a disappointment, and if there's anything that I like really regret reading this year, I think it might be this because I certainly read things that were worse, but this just felt like such a complete like waste of time. I don't know. I think that's a little bit harsh, but it just wasn't for me. The Wolf Den by Ellie Harper is historical fiction about women in a brothel in Pompeii. I thought this was great. I like how it explored their experiences of solidarity together through oppression and violence, as well as looking at like historical sexual norms and power and freedom. It was really interesting, and I'm definitely going to continue the series next year. Next was Landscapes by Christine Lai, which is part exploration of rape in classical art and part exploration of like restoration remembrance in a world that's being destroyed by climate change. I thought it was very unique and thoughtful. It felt like a little bit kind of distant, but I really liked learning about art and especially some of the really specific artists that are talked about a lot, like Turner. Next was Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, which I really enjoyed. I feel like again, I don't have anything super special to say about it, but I think it's amazing how much is packed into such a small story and how much it made me feel for like how little time I spent with the characters in the story. I read The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, which I feel is very painful and very like realistic and grounded. This look at people who really want to make their mark on the world and not feel alone, but struggle very relatably in trying to do so. It also looks at race and class in the US in a way that feels very relevant. And I'm also so amazed. The author was very young. I think she was 21 or 22 when she wrote this. And I think that is just really amazing. I thought this was great. Then I read The Household by Stacey Hall, which is historical fiction about a real sort of social project that Charles Dickens sponsored, attempting to quote unquote rehabilitate fallen women. Kind of looks at these women's experiences trying to make it in Victorian England. through like sexism and poverty and like the importance of their relationships with each other and all of these sort of Victorian social standards. I had a period of time where I was obsessed with Victorian literature and I was kind of learning about feminism at the same time, so I just think I would have been like truly, truly obsessed with this if I'd read it then. I liked it now, but yeah, that was one that really would have been perfect for like 17-year-old Charlotte. Then I read A Crane Among Wolves by June Her, which is young adult mystery slash historical fiction set in medieval Korea. This also had a really nice romance. It's a combination of stuff that I don't know if I've read before, and I thought that it did a great job with all of it. I am going to read more of her stuff, and I really definitely recommend this one. I don't recommend reading it the way that I did, which was just like, I'm going to sit down and not think about anything because it was another one of my stress marathon reads after I moved. I got caught up with the Useful Woman series by Darcy Wilde. They're these very cozy, sort of gentle Regency mysteries with a great cast of characters. I didn't really know if I would like historical mysteries, but I had a friend get really into them, and I read them with her and I had a lot of fun reading them with her. And I think the next book actually comes out on Christmas Eve this year, so I might have read the next one by the end of this year, or might not have. But yeah, very cozy, very fun Regency mysteries. That friend and I also read Matrix by Lauren Groff, which I thought just had very, very beautiful, luminous writing. Luminous is the word that I guess I decided to put in all caps on my PowerPoint. And just the main character's way of like interacting with the world and seeing her world and trying to change it was very interesting. I saw a lot of people say they didn't like how kind of expository the writing was and that they didn't like how much time passed through the book. And I understand those critiques, but I liked the other parts of it so much that it didn't bother me too much. Okay, my next stress marathon read for the second job is Poor Dear by Clara Oshetsky, which, by the way, has been labeled as magical realism in a few places. I would say it's very marginal magical realism at best. I was going to use it for bingo, but then I just decided I don't think it's enough magical realism to count. But I liked this. I thought that the author was really talented in writing a very young child's perspective and trying to understand like this terrible tragedy that happens and then being shaped by it over time. There's just something that was missing that I didn't quite make it amazing, but I thought it was really well written, especially just like getting inside the perspective of a really young kid trying to make sense of things. Next, I read Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaughey, which was another marathon read related to my second job. In a line, I feel like as this settled, I like it less and less. I especially there's something about like the interpersonal parts of the book and the trauma focused parts of the book that I just don't think quite worked for me, but I did really like its exploration of wolf reintroduction and like the wolves' impacts on environment and humans and, kind of the nature of wolves and their intelligence and how their societies work and stuff like that. But the rest of it didn't work for me, and I kind of like it less the more that I think about it. The next book I read was Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. And again, this was a stress marathon read. Like the month of like October, like September, October, I was just really going through it with like a combination of school stuff and work stuff. And I guess my way of coping with that seems to have been like marathoning a bunch of lit fic, which, honestly, as far as coping skills go, like it's not the worst. This was one of my favorites of the year. I just feel like the way that it created its narrator's character and its narrator's voice was so interesting and unique and made me want to just keep reading from her perspective and how she sees the world for much longer. So I will be reading more from this author with certainty, and I know that's not a shocking opinion to have, but I'm glad that I read this and that I enjoyed it as much as I did. And last in this section is What Souls Are Made Of by Tasha Suri, who I've talked about before because of her fantasy books that I really like. But this is a Wuthering Heights retelling with Kathy and Heathcliff, who are they're teenagers at this point in time. They both have Indian heritage, and it's kind of an exploration of like what could have happened to help them find their way back to each other instead of going off the deep end. And uh, that involves finding their heritage and kind of working through some of their trauma. And in the end, they decide that they're going to like fight against colonialism instead of uh, what I said here. I like some of the writing that I included in this PowerPoint. I said they're going to wreak anti-colonial havoc instead of multi-generational trauma upon their descendants. So I like the way I phrased that, and I like that ending to this book. And yeah, I really love Tasha Suri's books. I feel like the way she writes romances is great. So I liked her take on Kathy and Heathcliff kind of before they turned into toxic monsters. Um, and I wish that she would just write more romances because I love them. I don't really know how to do this final section because it's nonfiction and I read a lot this year, but a lot of it is like therapy and treatment modalities and like school related stuff. So I don't necessarily know how interesting that would be to people, but I did want to like include it in a wrap up. So I'm just going to go through it really briefly, and if I have something major to say about it, I will. The Inner Work of Racial Justice by Rhonda V. McGee, which is about using mindfulness and meditation to work towards racial justice. And Clean by David Sheff, which is about understanding the nature of substance use and kind of the stigma around it and the intervention methods that actually work. Save the Cat writes a novel by Jessica Brody because I'm trying to work on my writing, and I feel like this is always recommended. I just feel like I struggle a lot with plotting, and so I was trying to read a little bit about that, and I think that this was fine. I really loved The Gift of Therapy by Irvin D. Yalom, which was a really wonderful collection of sort of like short essays or letters for therapists from Irvin D. Yalom, who is a very famous existential therapist. Full of books about fat positivity and fat phobia. What we don't talk about when we talk about fat by Aubrey Gordon, and The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. I read Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life by Stephen Hayes, which is like a workbook version of acceptance and commitment therapy. Inferior by Angela Saini, which is about kind of neuroscience and science around gender differences and sexism. Doing Psychotherapy by Robin Shapiro, Decolonizing Therapy by Jennifer Mullen, Truth and Repair by Judith Herman, which I think I talked about in my, I don't even remember what video. I talked about it. I read this at the time that I was working. I just moved to Albuquerque and was really struggling with my new job at the district attorney's office. It basically talks about specifically trauma survivors' experiences in the criminal justice system and how most survivors truly envision what justice looks like to them and the things that we could be doing differently. Judith Herman is very well known as a trauma psychologist and someone who helped develop trauma treatments and the development of PTSD, and I really, really resonated with what she said here, and I think it would be a great read for anybody interested and thinking about those topics. Around the same time, I read Violence: Reflections on a National Epidemic by James Gilligan, who worked as a doctor at a prison that was extremely violent at the time, and he implemented changes that drastically helped to reduce the violence. This is kind of his reflection on his time working with the incarcerated individuals who had often committed very extreme crimes, often committed a lot of self-violence, and just kind of how they conceptualize violence, how he sees violence as something that they're doing to try to protect themselves. I don't know. I was really going through it at this point in time and just trying to, get some more perspectives on the things that I was seeing and, the criminal justice system in relationship to violence. I read So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson. This was another stress marathon read. It was okay, but it wasn't quite what I was looking for. More school books were The Mindfulness Solution by Ronald D. Siegel, Mindfulness-Based Treatment Approaches by Ruth A. Bear, Integrated Treatment of Co-Occurring Disorders by Jack Clott, and then some other therapy-related books were The Compassionate Mind Approach to Recovering from Trauma Using Compassion-Focused Therapy. Compassion-focused therapy is basically a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that incorporates elements of self-compassion practice and mindfulness. And then similarly, the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, which I I think I mentioned in one of my other videos, I've been reading on and off for a long time and just kind of working through very slowly, and finally finished to a point where I had gone through all the exercises and felt like I had a handle on a lot of the ideas and skills to hopefully be able to share with others. And then last was The Making of a Therapist by Louis Cozolino. So that was all the nonfic I read. Obviously, a lot, mostly just school-related stuff, or therapy-related stuff, or work-related stuff. A couple of other pieces of nonfic not quite related to those, which I'm hoping I can expand on. But yeah, mostly psychology, therapy, social work-related stuff for now. So my conclusion, by my count, I read 86 books total. 10 were stress marathon reads. I think I may have forgotten to say which ones in a couple of the PowerPoint slides, but I think they're all labeled correctly. 5 Evil Forest books. My very least favorites, although they're not technically the worst, they are just the ones that I was the most personally irritated by, or the most annoyed by, or found the most problematic to me in some way. I really did not like Lady Macbeth just because of this chasm between what it thinks it's doing and how badly it actually does that. And then, like I said, Remarkably Bright Creatures, I just felt like it was a waste of time. I did not find it entertaining or interesting, the way that a lot of my worst reads were. I read a lot of good stuff this year. Probably my favorites, if I had to choose 3, Truth and Repair by Judith Herman. As I mentioned, it just says everything that I think people need to know about trauma and criminal justice and what justice looks like. These are things that I've been so angry about and struggled to articulate for years, and I just think she does a beautiful job of describing it all. The Practice, the Horizon, and the Chain by Sofia Samatar. Beautiful writing, so smart and compassionate about courage and resistance, and in a way that makes me feel very hopeful. And then Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, which I just think is so completely unique in its voice and perspective. Probably a couple of other runners up. I do think, I don't necessarily think it's like a book to rate the same way that a lot of these were, but I do really recommend the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook. I think it has a really great set of super transformative practices. I really liked Gather the Daughters. I don't know. Honestly, I read a lot of really good stuff this year. Those are probably my top 3. But yeah, it was just a very solid year. Next year, my goal is to finish bingo. I only have, I think, 7 or 8 books left for that, so that'll happen pretty quickly. I don't know. Here's what I said. Be intentional about my reading choices as they refine my taste, but save room for spontaneity. So one of the things that I kind of feel this year is that, I'm always going to listen to something or other when I'm driving, so it might as well be an audiobook that's, kind of funny. But I feel like I spent a lot of my sitting reading, paper book or ebook time on, things that aren't necessarily top priorities. They're just kind of things that I thought would be funny or entertaining. And that's fine. I think I can save room for that, but I just feel like I have so much stuff that I really think will be good that I want to read, and I'm getting a better sense of what I like and don't like. So I kind of want to incorporate that a little bit more. I have been setting my Goodreads reading challenge to 1 book for the past few years, and I really like that just because I feel like, different years have different flows to them. Sometimes you read more times than others, and I don't want to be pressuring myself to read the absolute most or to feel stressed about being behind on a challenge just because, life stuff is happening or I'm not feeling like reading at that time. So I just use Goodreads, the reading challenge, to keep track of what I've read in a year and not, stressing myself out about reading enough. I also realized I read a lot of psychology and therapy stuff this year. A lot of it was for school, but there was plenty of it that was, my own outside reading. And I think that's because as I've been actually starting to do the work, I've been kind of panicking, oh my God, I don't know enough. I have to cram and I have to learn all these different types of therapy and listen to all these different experts. And that is important, but I also think that a lot of people have been saying, you're where you need to be and this is normal at the start. And it's also very helpful to just focus on being present in the room and where you're at in the learning process, which I think I've been doing, but I think just maybe leaning a bit more into that and not feeling quite so panicked about like having to read certain books from different perspectives or modalities and having to check those off the list. And of course, if I read My Immortal 2 times this year, my next year's goal is to read My Immortal 3 times, just to set a new personal record. So that is my yearly reading recap. I am looking forward to hearing anybody else's thoughts about what they read this year, anything that I did mention. I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to put some stuff out next year. We'll see what happens. I have a few ideas in the works. I don't ever want to guarantee anything on here, but one way or another, you can always follow this channel. I also post a lot pretty actively on Goodreads and Reddit, and I also post a lot of book reviews and writing updates and stuff like that on my author website and the blog there. So feel free to check any of that out if you want to. Of course, no worries if not, and I just appreciate you staying by to hear what I have to say today. I hope everybody has a good new year, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Technically not seeing because you don't see my face this time, but you know what I mean. To hearing more in the next year. Okay, bye.